In 1829, Philadelphia opened the most expensive building in America. It was not a hospital. It was not a government hall. It was a prison. It was built on a radical idea that total isolation could transform a criminal into a changed man. One of the most famous authors in the world, Charles Dickens, walked inside, spoke to the prisoners, and called it something else entirely: torture. The story of Eastern State Penitentiary begins not with criminals or punishment, but with a dinner party. In 1787, weeks before the Constitutional Convention, a group of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens gathered at the home of Benjamin Franklin. Among them was Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and the man history would later call the father of American psychiatry. Rush had a theory that would reshape the country. He believed crime was not a moral failing, it was a disease, and like any disease, it could be cured. The cure Rush proposed was radical: strip away every distraction, remove the noise of the outside world, place a person in complete solitude with nothing but silence and a Bible, and wait for their conscience to do its work. The human soul, Rush argued, could be changed from within. All you had to do was give it room to breathe. He called this process penitence. The building designed to produce it would need a new word: penitentiary. Rush and Franklin founded the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, an organization that would spend the next 4 decades turning this idea into stone and iron. They needed an architect. They found one in John Haviland, an Englishman who had arrived in Philadelphia after meeting John Quincy Adams in Russia. The project cost roughly $780,000, a staggering amount of money at the time. Adjusted for inflation, it would be the equivalent of roughly $25 million today. By a wide margin, it was the most expensive building ever constructed in the young nation. On October 23, 1829, the doors opened. The first person to walk through them was a young black man from Harrisburg named Charles Williams. He had been convicted of theft and sentenced to 2 years. He was given a number, a cell, and a hood. He became prisoner number 1 of what Philadelphia promised would be the most humane correctional system on earth, and Haviland had designed a building to match that promise, something the world had never seen. 7 cell blocks radiated outward from a central octagonal hub, like the spokes of a wheel. A single guard standing at the center could observe every corridor at once. Each cell measured 8 feet by 12 feet, with a vaulted ceiling 10 feet high. Every cell had its own private exercise yard, its own running water, its own flush toilet, and central heating. Haviland placed a skylight in each ceiling, a single opening to the sky that he called the Eye of God. It was the only light the prisoner would see. The exterior told a different story. Haviland wrapped the prison in 30-foot Gothic walls with castle-like towers, designed to terrify anyone who passed. The walls extended 10 feet underground to prevent tunneling. From the outside, Eastern State looked like a medieval fortress. From the inside, it felt like a cathedral. That contrast was deliberate. Fear on the outside, redemption on the inside. When it opened, Eastern State Penitentiary had amenities that the White House did not: running water, flush toilets, and central heat. The prisoners lived in better physical conditions than most free Americans. But the rules inside those walls were unlike anything the country had ever imposed on its own citizens. This was the Pennsylvania system. Every prisoner lived in total isolation, 23 hours a day. They worked alone, ate alone, and slept alone. When moved through the corridors, they wore black hoods so they could not see another human face. They were forbidden from speaking. Their only permitted reading was the Bible. Their only human contact was the warden, who was legally required to visit each prisoner once a day, and the occasional moral instructor. The theory was simple: remove every external influence, and the prisoner's own conscience would do the rest. The idea was that silence would force a man to face himself, and solitude would do the teaching. If you had to spend a single year in total silence, with nothing but your own thoughts and a Bible, what do you think would happen to your mind? Drop your answer in the comments, because the men who built Eastern State were absolutely certain they knew the answer, and they were wrong. For a brief period, the world believed Philadelphia had gotten it right. The French political writer Alexis de Tocqueville traveled from France in 1831 and spent a week at Eastern State Penitentiary, interviewing every prisoner. He praised what he found, but Eastern State had a rival. Auburn Prison in New York developed a competing philosophy. Prisoners worked together in enforced silence by day and returned to small individual cells at night. Flogging maintained order. The Auburn system was cheaper to build, generated revenue through factory labor, and was easier to scale. It would eventually win the argument in America. But Haviland's radial architecture, the physical expression of the Pennsylvania system, spread further than either side could have imagined. Over 300 prisons on 4 continents copied the design, from Pentonville in London to institutions across South America, Europe, and Asia. Eastern State Penitentiary became more famous internationally than the White House. Philadelphia had not just built a prison, it had built what it believed was the future of civilization. But the visitors who came to admire the system sometimes left with a very different impression. In 1842, Charles Dickens arrived in Philadelphia during his first American tour. The prison administrators were thrilled to show him their achievement. Dickens went cell by cell, speaking with inmates one at a time. What he found horrified him. He met a sailor who had been locked in solitary confinement for 11 years. The man would stare at his own hands for hours, picking at the flesh on his fingers. He met prisoners who had lost the ability to speak in full sentences. He was told that released inmates often could not sign their own names in the discharge book. Some could not even hold the pen. Dickens left Philadelphia and wrote about what he had seen. His words were brutal. The slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain, he wrote, was immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. He called it a secret punishment, one which slumbering humanity had not yet roused up to stay. He did not soften his language. He compared what he had witnessed to burying a person alive, and he warned that the damage would not stay contained behind those Gothic walls. It would follow the prisoners out into the world, broken men released into a society that had broken them. The prison's defenders dismissed Dickens as a foreigner, an entertainer who did not understand American values or American justice. They pointed out that he had visited for only a single day. They accused him of sensationalism. But the evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. The Boston Prison Discipline Society published report after report documenting insanity among solitary prisoners. By 1838, they had created an entirely new category in their annual statistics just to track the problem. Prison physicians at Eastern State acknowledged that inmates were losing their minds, but they blamed the prisoners themselves. Black inmates, they wrote, were racially predisposed to mental collapse. Others, they claimed, had been driven insane by their own immoral habits. The system, they insisted, was sound. The patients were defective. 3 years after Dickens condemned Eastern State, another famous reformer arrived and reached the opposite conclusion. Dorothea Dix, the woman history remembers as the greatest champion of the mentally ill in 19th century America, toured the prison and praised it. She published a book in 1845 in which she argued that the benefits of the Pennsylvania system far outweighed any of its costs. She acknowledged some concerns, but her overall verdict was clear. The same woman who spent her life fighting to liberate people from inhumane confinement looked at Eastern State Penitentiary and saw progress. She saw a system worth defending. The person who did more than anyone to expose the horrors of the asylum endorsed the very system that was producing the same kind of suffering inside a prison. What Dix saw on her guided tour was not the full picture. The administrators showed visitors clean cells, quiet corridors, and orderly routines. They did not show them what happened when the silence broke down. Behind closed doors, the punishments at Eastern State had escalated far beyond solitude. In 1833, just 4 years after the prison opened, a prisoner named Matthias Macumsey died after guards applied a device called the iron gag. It was a metal instrument forced over the tongue and chained to the wrists behind the back. Any movement of the hands tore at the mouth. Any movement of the mouth pulled at the wrists. The prison physician attributed the death to apoplexy. Witnesses believed the gag killed him. Warden Samuel Wood had the body removed under cover of darkness and told his guards to keep their own secrets. A state investigation 2 years later documented additional methods. Guards doused prisoners with buckets of water and left them chained outdoors through the winter. They strapped inmates into devices called mad chairs, leather restraints pulled so tight they cut off circulation to the limbs. They confined prisoners in underground cells with no light, no heat, and no bedding. The investigators reviewed the evidence. The majority concluded that these punishments were, in their words, not inappropriate. The punishments were brutal. But what ultimately killed the Pennsylvania system was not cruelty, it was math. Eastern State was designed for roughly 250 prisoners, each in a private cell with a private yard. By the 1860s, overcrowding forced administrators to put 2 prisoners in cells built for 1. The solitary system, the entire philosophical foundation of the institution, became physically impossible to maintain. By 1913, the Pennsylvania system was officially abandoned. By the 1920s, the prison held over 1,700 inmates. Group dining halls replaced solitary meals. A baseball diamond appeared in the yard. The corridors that were designed for silence now echoed with the noise of an ordinary, overcrowded American prison. By the 20th century, the prison that was built for silent contemplation had become something else entirely, and it started attracting a very different kind of resident. In 1929, exactly 100 years after Eastern State opened, A.L. Capone arrived as prisoner C-5527. He had been sentenced to 1 year for carrying a concealed weapon. The newspapers went wild. The Philadelphia Public Ledger described his cell as lavishly furnished with tasteful paintings, a polished desk, and a powerful cabinet radio. The story stuck. For decades, Capone's cell was presented as proof that the famous gangster had bought himself a luxury suite behind bars. But when the prison conducted its own investigation in 2019, stripping back over 20 layers of paint during a restoration project, the reality turned out to be far more ordinary. A competing newspaper at the time had described the same cell in much plainer terms. The furnishings were typical. The legend was better than the truth. What is documented about Capone's time at Eastern State is more interesting than the furniture myth. He had contracted syphilis as a young man and never sought treatment. By the time he reached Philadelphia, the disease was progressing toward his brain. He served roughly 8 months, sharing his cell with an embezzler named Bill Coleman, who slept on a cot beside him. There was no luxury suite. There was a sick man in a crowded prison, serving out a relatively minor sentence while his mind slowly deteriorated. He would eventually die in 1947 with what physicians described as the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. The most powerful gangster in America spent his final years unable to recognize his own family. Capone served his time and left. But another inmate would leave Eastern State in a far more dramatic fashion. Willie Sutton was a bank robber famous for stealing an estimated $2 million without ever killing anyone. He attempted to escape Eastern State at least 5 times. The most elaborate attempt came on April 3, 1945, and it was actually masterminded not by Sutton, but by a fellow inmate named Clarence Klinedunst. Klinedunst was a trusted prison mason who had been given permission to replaster his own cell. Instead, he spent an entire year digging. The tunnel went 15 feet down, 97 feet out beneath Fairmount Avenue, and 15 feet back up to the surface. 12 inmates crawled through and emerged on the street. Sutton was recaptured within minutes, just 2 blocks away. Another escapee, James Grace, managed to stay free for 8 days before he walked back to the prison, rang the front doorbell, and surrendered. He said he was hungry. The tunnel was filled with ash from the prison incinerator. 70 years later, in 2015, robotic cameras captured the first images of its interior since the day it was sealed. The celebrities came and went, but the institution itself was running out of time. Eastern State Penitentiary closed on April 1, 1970. It was briefly reactivated as a city jail in 1971, then shut down for good. The last prisoners were transferred to the new Graterford facility northwest of Philadelphia. The city debated demolishing the building to make room for a shopping center. Some proposed turning the 11-acre site into condominiums. For over 20 years, nothing happened. The Gothic walls still stood on Fairmount Avenue, towering over a neighborhood that grew up around them. But inside, the corridors were empty. Trees grew through the cell blocks, their roots splitting concrete floors that had been laid over a century earlier. Vines crept through the skylights Haviland had called the Eye of God. Rainwater pooled in the exercise yards where prisoners once paced in solitary circles. Cats colonized the corridors. Nature was finishing what Dickens had started with words, taking the place apart. Then something unexpected happened. A preservation movement gained traction. In 1994, the prison reopened, not as a functioning institution, but as a museum. The decision was made to maintain Eastern State as what conservators call a stabilized ruin. No restoration, no reconstruction. The building would be preserved exactly as time had left it, crumbling but standing. A reminder of what happens when a good idea meets reality. Today, the museum draws over 200,000 visitors a year. Formerly incarcerated men and women serve as tour guides, walking visitors through the same corridors where prisoners once wore hoods to prevent them from seeing another human face. A massive steel sculpture called the Big Graph tracks the explosion of American incarceration from the 1970s to the present. Eastern State does not present itself as a relic of a problem that has been solved. It presents itself as the origin point of a problem that has not. In 1890, the United States Supreme Court acknowledged what Dickens had written nearly 50 years earlier. Prisoners subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, the justices wrote, fell into a semi-fatuous condition, barely able to think or respond, or became violently insane. In 2015, 173 years after Dickens walked the corridors of Eastern State, Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote a concurrence that read almost like a paraphrase of the novelist. The physical architecture has changed. The debate has not. Eastern State Penitentiary was built by people who believed, with complete sincerity, that a building could change a human soul. That silence was medicine. That solitude was mercy. They poured more money into that belief than any structure in the country. They designed skylights they called the Eye of God, and corridors that echoed like churches. And then they filled those corridors with human beings and watched year after year as the results came back wrong. Can a society design its way to justice? Or do some problems refuse to be solved by walls, no matter how carefully they are built? America asked that question in 1829. It still has not answered it. If you think the founders of Eastern State got something right, or if you think they got everything wrong, leave your thoughts in the comments.